Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And today we're here to ask a critical question. Is the attention economy undermining our democracy? This term, attention economy, refers to the business model that dominates today's digital platforms, one where success is measured not in truth, quality, or civic value, but in how long a user stays glued to the screen. It's an economy built on harvesting attention, maximizing engagement, and doing so by appealing often to our baser instincts. And as Andrew McDougall argues in his new MLI paper, this model isn't just harming traditional journalism, it's corroding the very foundations of democratic society. This is a topic that I care deeply about. I've seen firsthand how the incentives baked into the modern information ecosystem are making it harder to sustain informed public debate, serious journalism, and even a functional attention span or shared sense of reality. And so joining me to unpack this, we have Andrew McDougall, author of the paper, senior writer and strategist, and former director of communications to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Thanks for being here, Andrew. And Katie Harbath, CEO of Anchor Change, former director of policy at Facebook for global elections, and one of the most experienced voices at the intersection of tech platforms and democracy. And last but not least, we have Dr. Ravi Iyer, a social psychologist, managing director of the Neely Center for Ethical Leadership and Decision Making at the USC's Neely Center, as well as director of the Psychology of Technology Institute. He is also a research lead for Jonathan Haidt, an expert in digital ethics, and he also has past roles at Meta's civic integrity team. So before we get started, I just want to remind everyone to like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these conversations. So thank you, the three of you, for being here with us. Andrew, I'd like to turn it over to you first to introduce yourself and a couple big ideas about the work you've undertaken here. Your paper, it opens with a bold claim that journalism can't be saved unless we dismantle the attention economy. So help us understand that.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And first, thanks to MLI and to Katie and Ravi for joining us today. It's such a thrill to have so many people who are experts in this area to come discuss this topic. And yeah, just by way of background, as Peter said, I was director of communications for Stephen Harper, and I operated in politics at a time when these platforms were coming of age and becoming part of the political conversation. And as I followed that in my time after leaving government, I started to worry, like Peter expressed, about what we were doing to our information economy, what we were doing to our democracies by having these platforms become the forums for debate. And it's a radically different environment. And so when I started thinking about, the news industry and what was happening there and how could we maybe help it, it quickly became apparent to me that you couldn't help the news industry without looking at the environment in which it now lives. And I think public policy for most of the past 15, 20 years with respect to news in particular has been geared about how do you keep an industry solvent or adjusting to a digital reality. You had Web 1.0 where news organizations gave their content away for free. You had Web 2.0, the social web, where they relied on the platforms to do their customer relationship management. The platforms ended up knowing more about the reader than the outlet did. And now we're into this world of, as Peter says, what we call now the attention economy. And it is a very different environment. And I think one that is antithetical to the hosting of high quality information or expensive to produce information. If you look at it as a competition, what the news industry produces is expensive, difficult, and often not that much fun to read. And it is now competing against an ocean of content that is really wired and produced to tickle all of our brains' buttons, in terms of what we like. And so do I read that serious piece of journalism about the new crime bill that just come out, or do I zone out on football videos for half an hour? And, it's sad to say we're the problem. That's another thing you kind of come to the conclusion when you start looking into this area, Peter, is that it's our demands that then get reflected back to us in this system. And as much as we like to hold ourselves up to be these paragons of virtue and knowledge seeking, quite often we just want to amuse ourselves. And You know, if you go back 30 years to Neil Postman and amusing ourselves to death, I think we are now like very firmly in that territory. And he was talking about television, of course, but this is the internet now, and algorithmic advertising-based social media, the attention economy. There's very few platforms, but they now compete in a no-holds-barred race to hold our attention. And the reason they do that is they do not make money. They don't get paid unless we're on their platform. And that's really a seismic shift. You could have multiple subscriptions to multiple old world newspapers and magazines, and as long as you paid that subscription fee, they probably didn't care too much how much you read or what grabbed your attention, only that you were satisfied with the product. And now we've become the product. That's the shift. We are now the thing that's sold and commoditized, our attention, which I argue is the world's most precious and finite resource. We only have so many minutes of a day, and where we choose to direct our attention means that's where we choose to focus, whether that's in politics, on our families. And I think we're starting to lose touch of or like you say, Pierre, our ability to really reach in and focus on things that matter.
It's a really helpful historical take on the shifts that have occurred, and this is at the core of your argument that yes, we've seen these things before to varying degree, but now it is much different in a number of ways, and our response needs to differ accordingly. So we'll get into that in the course of the conversation. Katie, would love to hear from you. You've worked inside platforms, Facebook, and with policymakers. So how have you seen this shift in information incentives reshape public discourse, policy, culture?
Yeah, first, thank you for having me. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Andrew, Robbie. Always great to be on a panel with you again, talking about all of this. So I have been reflecting a lot over the last 25 years. When I first started in politics, it was 2004. It was the very beginning of Facebook. YouTube didn't exist yet. Twitter didn't exist yet. TikTok, none of these. And there's a lot there where we equated more was better. So more clicks, the fact you can measure it, you assume that more was better. And we didn't think then about what those longer term impacts were going to be. And I think that there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from that as we're going into this next chapter of AI and what all of this looks like. I want to touch on a couple of things and how I'm thinking about this, and I know we'll go into it in the conversation. First, I just want to sort of mention my mantra that I've been using the last couple of years around all of this, which is panic responsibly. And what that means is that there are absolutely things that we need to be worried about, paying attention to, thinking about how we can change them for the better and how we improve discourse overall. But I also worry about where we go too far down that path, where the fear paralyzes us, where we think that we can't change anything, where we don't think that we have personal agency in addition to ways of being able to improve this at all. And so I feel, and you'll notice throughout my themes throughout this entire webinar, I'm very much sort of in this messy middle where I think that there are a lot of really hard trade-offs and no silver bullets to the answers to these questions. And that's why debates like this are really important. I want to double down on something Andrew was talking about in terms of like our attention and sort of how people are wanting to consume information now. There's a fantastic study by Google and Gemic that came out in, I think it was late 2023 or 2024. But it looked at Gen Z, and they found 7 different information modes that people are in when they're going to the internet for content. And Andrew's absolutely right. The biggest one was just passing the time. They want to go to TikTok or Instagram or wherever, and they want to be looking on cats on Roombas. They want to be watching gardening videos. They're kind of using it to decompress. But that doesn't mean they don't want politics and news. They just want to do it more on their terms. So I think this is why you're seeing the rise a bit of podcasts and Substack and newsletters in all of this, because it's a way for people to get that content and be in that mental mindset and intentionally wanting to go and see that. But the challenge with all of this, though, too, is that we want more competition in terms of more platforms, different ways for people to be able to pick and choose where they go. But with more platforms, that also means more fragmentation. It means more of an ability for people to just go and get within the groups of people that they like to be around and not necessarily be getting differing views. And so I think we need to look at those trade-offs around all of this. The last 2 things I'll just say is another one Daphne Keller has a fantastic piece in Lawfare from a while back, kind of talking about how, as we talk about regulation, thinking about how regulation can also have downsides in terms of turning things like trust and safety, which Ravi worked in the civic integrity team. I was sort of a policy partner to the civic integrity team. You want to be able to give those teams the ability to experiment and adapt and pivot. And many times regulation can just turn those into compliance functions where they're checking off boxes and just doing what needs to be done, the bare minimum of what the law says, so it can turn it into a ceiling rather than a floor. And so I think we need to think about how we make sure that what we're proposing isn't just regulatory, but other checks and balances that allows these teams to be able to have that sort of freedom, but also make sure that companies are all playing sort of at the same level. And the last thing I'll just say is that I 100% agree. I think we need culture change, not just across tech companies, but I also think across civil society, think tanks, and others. Many times when I'm having these conversations, people don't like to have the conversation in this messy middle because it's hard, because there's not, it can be politically fraught. There can be a lot of reasons why folks don't want to do that. And I really think, and I say this knowing it's like, especially with what's happening in America right now, this is so much easier said than done because so many people doing this work are being attacked. They are losing their funding. They are losing their jobs, which is an incredibly hard environment to operate in. But how can we think about better creating the cultures and the support that those folks need to continue to keep doing their jobs?
That was excellent, Katie. Thank you. Yeah, very astute to point out that we need to be prudent, and it's easy. I think we can all recognize now that there are a number of problems, but oftentimes our solutions don't do what they're intended to. And I think the paper provides both with its recommendation to study these issues further, but also some pretty targeted and narrow approaches as well as broad ones. So we'll discuss those and all the trade-offs. But before we do, over to you, Ravi. You understand very well the psychology of all of this, which is really at the core of the issue, the manipulation, some might say, or leveraging of our psychology for certain ends. Tell us about what you do and how you've seen this issue emerge over time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate the attention to this issue, which I think is super important. And I think it it doesn't just undermine our democracy. I think it undermines our aspirations in a lot of different ways. And maybe the one thing I agree with Andrew and the paper in so many ways. I might just go a little bit beyond it in the sense that I don't think we're necessarily the problem. I do think that the design of these platforms facilitates a lot of the negative externalities we see. And that there are some, maybe we don't know everything, but we do know some solutions that we can use to address these problems. So, psychology, we often talk about system one and system two. There's the things we want. And so, yes, maybe I do want to sit back and relax and watch some football videos, but I don't aspire to do that more in my life. I aspire, if you ask most people, they're not trying to spend more time on their phones. Most people, I do talks. I'm sure most people, if I were to poll them and I could see them now, they would tell me that they are trying to spend less time on their phones. They're not trying to use them more. I have 3 kids. I often find myself, on my phone when I should be paying more attention to them. I think most parents have an experience like that. I think a lot of us, realize these products are giving us what we quote want, in the same way that potato chips are what I want or donuts are what I want. But I don't aspire to eat more potato chips. I aspire to eat healthier. I aspire to eat kale or some other healthy food. And these products are not necessarily designed for that anymore, right? Originally, I think they were connecting us with people far away, and now they're just trying to consume our time increasingly. And that's unfortunate. It's not just social media. Video games are doing this. Gambling apps are trying to do this. Everyone's like shouting for our attention, and we're doing less of the things we aspire to do in life and more of the things that are just better for the businesses. Once upon a time, companies made money by providing value to consumers. And I think that's what's broken, and that's what we need to change. And so some of the ideas in Andrew's paper, I think, would help with that. Things like interoperability, where people are competing on value to consumers, not on creating the biggest network effect, so that the only way I can find out like what X person said, or I can not be left out of my friend group, is to be on these platforms. So, about half of people in polls are trying to use these products less. There's a lot of people who, if you ask them, they would pay for a world where nobody was using these products, as opposed to a world where everyone's using these products. And I do think this is something we can change. Two things I noted from my time at Meta: I worked both on the civic integrity team, I also worked on the newsfeed team. We did a lot of research. We would talk to publishers, we would talk to politicians. Some of this research is public in the world. You can read about these results. But a lot of them would say that they're being pushed to do things they're not proud of, right? So just like we as consumers are being pushed to do things we're not proud of, to use our products when we should be playing with our kids, publishers are being pushed to write stories they're not proud of, because they're covering crime news because it's cheap and it's easy and it gets good engagement, as opposed to covering something deep, right? And then it also enables bad actors, the tiny group of people who do want to manipulate people, to do it just by being hyperactive, right? So there's a lot of problems with the design of these systems. They're not serving value to consumers, and there are clear regulatory fixes that we can make to align the value that these products are. If these companies are going to be wildly profitable, they should be wildly profitable for providing value to consumers, not for taking up more and more of our time.
That's excellent. Gives us a really good segue into where I want to go first, because it is the core of the issue, so to speak, the addictive design. But as a more classically inclined philosopher, I can't help but note, Katie, you said early on in this process, we were, really enticed by the idea that more is just better, more is better. And I think, to the point of the cultural mix we're in, we seem, as Ravi, you've noted, like everyone knows, obviously not all of our desires are equally good, and there are higher and lower ones, but really that's not the policy and cultural milieu in which we operate. Like, my freedom to choose is kind of a foundational principle, and we have a very hard time thinking outside of that. And I think it's why we haven't really seen any meaningful stop to this yet. But in many other areas of policy, we're starting to see some of these foundational assumptions about choice and desire be questioned. So let's focus on the addictive design. So what are the most harmful design features that you think are driving the attention economy? Some that Andrew notes in the paper: infinite scroll, autoplay, algorithmic amplification. Andrew, why don't we start with you, and others chime in after.
Yeah, and I would add the recommendation engine, and I think again this idea that what we express interest in once gives some sort, and it does give an indication of what we like, but it doesn't necessarily put bounds, or shouldn't put bounds, on what we're interested in. And I think we're now in a system that kind of winnows us down forevermore, it feels like, into these areas. And just to go back to the analog world, part of the thing I love about still reading, say, the Weekend FT or the Sunday Times, is I find all sorts of news I didn't know I was interested in, because somebody has put together a product for me that is not just based on what it knows about me, but it made a choice about what it thinks is an important thing in the world. And I think when the platforms backed into this and started designing, as Ravi notes and Katie notes, at the beginning, it was very much about utility. How can I connect people? But then it was, as they start putting all this content on our platforms, it costs a lot of money to host this stuff. We're getting big. We have to grow bigger. People are valuing us based on how big our user growth projections are. So we have to do more. And then you have to find a way to pay for that. And I think that's where the design comes in. Now, all the creativity and ingenuity is being put into, how do I make the platform more addictive or compelling from a time spending point? And that's where you get into some of the things you note. There's no law that says you have to have a bottomless well of content for me to read. That's new in human history. A paper was always a defined number of pages. A magazine was a certain length. A book's a certain length. Now you can literally fill your boots until you fall over. You can just keep scrolling down if you want. People weren't watching enough video. We'll start the next one right away, and provide them with recommendations that are similar to that. And and then you really do see the competition being within the platform market. Of if TikTok takes off because they found a better algorithm that can put content in front that people want to swipe and look at, then Instagram suddenly becomes more TikTok-like with the Reels function. And I look at one tragic video of the Air India flight from a month ago or so crashing after takeoff, and my feed right away is chock full of aviation videos. And I don't aspire to watch that, to Ravi's point, but humans are hardwired to rubberneck the car crash, right? We like to look at things that are frightening, scary, difficult. And that's a different brief to the traditional information economy, the news industry in particular, like all the news that's fit to print. And sure, if it bleeds, it leads. We've always had a sensationalism, but now it's just infinitely repeatable. And I think those platform feature designs that we talked about are the main ones that keep us on these platforms, not for the purpose of informing us more or making us better citizens, but just to let people reach into our wallets for just that little bit longer, to serve us content and advertising when we're feeling vulnerable, when we're feeling scared. And they know this. They know exactly our emotional state and when it's most lucrative, time of day, state of mind, etc. To reach into that wallet. And that's wholly new. And to Ravi and Katie's point, we can change that. That's a design choice, and it's optimized to make the most money for the platforms. It doesn't have to be that way.
Great. Katie, Ravi, anything to add on this point?
I mean, I think it's important to get into the specifics of how these algorithms are designed. So if you read Facebook's blog about, how they design the newsfeed, it is optimized, in part by, what will get you to slow down and pay attention to a particular piece of content, right? So that rubbernecking that Andrew talks about. It is not optimized for what I, love reacted to as much, right? I'm sure it's somewhere in the algorithm, but like a lot of the things, there's a difference. So you can construct an algorithm that appeals to your aspirations or that appeals to your rubbernecking nature. And there are all sorts of signals you can use. And when you optimize a system for things that are just, I paid attention to it. So things like I slowed down and looked at this thing for longer than a certain amount of time. I clicked on it. Like these are things that indicate attention, not necessarily desire. Or you could have more explicit signals, and you have platforms that do, are all along the spectrum. There are platforms that have like explicit thumbs up and thumbs down. Facebook itself has optimized, has experimented with like a see more, see less. What do I aspire to see more of? What am I explicitly telling you I want to see more of versus what am I paying attention to? And you actually do see policymakers. We have these addictive feed laws in New York and California that passed that actually are trying to, especially for kids, who don't have the self-control to control like what are they paying attention to, that sort of mandate that a feed that is more in the aspirational sense and less in the what am I paying attention to sense. And these things have real consequences. So like 1 in 5 kids will say that they see content that makes them feel worse about themselves. 1 in 5 kids will say that they see content, unwanted sexually explicit content, not content they're looking for, but content that they're seeing that maybe they're not ready for. So I think that, when we really dive into the details of these systems, there are real ways that they could optimize for aspirations and not for what are we paying attention to if they wanted to.
If I could add just a couple of other things to this, and Ravi, I'd be curious your thoughts on this too, but I do want to point out a couple of things that different platforms are trying to and have tried to do in the past to try to help think about this. So I know there's been times at TikTok, especially late at night, I'm not proud of it, but I was scrolling and I started to get notices of like, it was basically like, maybe you should go to sleep now. There's things on Apple you can set so that you can only be on these apps for so long. I really love that TikTok has the feature that you can wipe your For You feed, so you can start all over again in terms of training what you might see in that feed. And I don't say all of this to say that, it's just all up to the user and choice, because I do think there's a balance to this. But I do think that as we continue to have this conversation and kind of thinking about where are those friction points that, allow people to take more control over their feeds, and how do we help people actually know that they can take that control and want to take that time to do that, because that's always been a challenge too. Of oftentimes, if you show somebody be like, you have to do this before you can see content, they're just going to click through it so they can get to their feed. And so how do you, and this is something I know Ravi's studied quite a bit. So it's not as simple as just being, let's make sure we have these tools there, but then how do we also incentivize people to actually use them to make sure that they're hitting that more aspirational goal of what it is that they're hoping to see versus what they're just being fed.
That's a great point. There are different ways of going about regulation, and to your point, you have to give the companies in question here a fair degree of credit, because they have been innovating to find different ways of providing opportunities for the user to to control the experience.
If I could just jump in there, Peter. So just
sure.
on that point, I think it's interesting that if you look at how TikTok, to Katie's point, if you look at Douyin and how it runs in China, it is markedly different to how it runs in the West. And I think if you look particularly for kids, if you look at the default the settings that are in place and the content that travels on the platform, it is not anything like what a North American teen would look at. And there's a French researcher whose name's escaping right now, who's the kind of king of all this stuff. And I'm sure somebody on the panel will be able to give me the name. But if you look at the ability for that platform in particular to stand up entirely new versions of the platform, say when Ukraine invaded Russia, it flipped basically in a week. And I think that gives you some indication how the autocrats and autocratic nations allow this technology to be used is a fear of how it would be used against them, but also a recognition that how we're doing it over here in the West, our very freedoms kind of being used against us and our principles being used against us. And I think that's part of if you look at the conversation, which we'll probably get to about how do you mobilize action in there, if you look at what the Western democracies are doing with these platforms and the regulation and what other countries are doing, you see a different approach. And we ought to ask the question why that is. Not to say that they'll have a better reason, but it bears asking why we let these platforms, to Ravi's point, Katie's point, why we allow them to set default settings the way they do, why they make it difficult to get into discovery and disclosure in legal proceedings, why they make it difficult to share with legislators exactly how these platforms are architected and operated.
I think it's a really good point to draw the two extremes perhaps, and Katie's comment about finding a middle path. Ravi, you have a...
Well, I just wanted to emphasize one word that Andrew said a couple times, which was the word default. And sort of a response to Katie that there are a lot of settings that exist on these platforms that it's great that they have them. 99% of people will not use them and have no idea they exist. And platforms know that. And so they set the defaults in ways that are beneficial to the platforms. And you can change it to be more beneficial to you. And there's 70% of kids in a common sense media study said that they feel manipulated by these platforms, right? So the defaults are not necessarily what the users would choose, but they can't figure out how to change them. So ideally, we would mandate that platforms or somehow business pressure, whatever it is we got to do, so that the defaults are on our side. And if you want to change it so that it's more attention getting or lizard brain setting or keeps you up at night, great, you can change it to that way. But I think a lot of people would keep the defaults in the healthier set if that's where they started versus where they are now.
That's really interesting. So I want to move to the policy discussion, but first, I'd like to hear from maybe you first, Ravi, and others jump in. How do the various features in question here affect users' attention, well-being, and even political behavior? And maybe Katie, Andrew, you'd have thoughts on that.
I mean, there's both acute and longer term effects, right? So the obvious effect is that for kids, kids sleep less, right? They're using these platforms 4.8, 5 hours a day on average, which means that there's some kids using it 8 hours a day. There just isn't time to do other things that are important, like sleeping, like studying. Kids themselves will tell you that a large percentage of kids, 40+% of kids will tell you that it's affecting their sleep. And we all know how sleep is important for mental health and development. So, there's just a lot of, very obvious effects. There's also social comparison. Kids are seeing content that makes them feel worse about themselves. Everyone wants to be an influencer these days. This is not a healthy way of being, right? That's not an actual career. So yeah, I mean, I think and then there's the acute harms, right? So some number of kids are bullied, some number of kids see unwanted sexual content, some are sexually, they're contacted by someone and scammed for naked pictures of themselves. Unfortunately, some number actually, commit suicide as a result. So there are both these acute harms and then these more benign harms. And that's not to say that there aren't benefits, but the fact that there's a group of kids over here who are experiencing benefits and a group of here experiencing harms, it doesn't really help the kids who are experiencing harms that there are these other kids experiencing benefits. There's a large number of kids. This is the uncontroversial thing rather than trying to do a balancing test. The uncontroversial thing is there's a large number of kids who are experiencing both these subtler effects of lack of sleep or these more acute effects of feeling bullied online, being contacted by someone online. And there are known design changes that we can make to these platforms to affect those things, and we should do those.
Great. Andrew, Katie, do you have anything to add about the polarization or attention spans, anything like that?
I mean, I think I'll go. I think when you look at how it impacts politics, I don't think it's a coincidence that our politics has gotten as scrambled as it has gotten over the past 15 years. If you look at the rise of these platforms, I think it's a straight line. And I'll give you a practical example. You know, in the job I used to have, Director of Communications to the Prime Minister, things move so quickly in government that the challenge was always, how do we do strategy and long-term thinking and implement that over time when you're caught up in the daily rat race that is the media environment around politics and government. You know, I would wake up to 1,000 emails, news transcripts. I would get 100 phone calls a day from reporters, you know, on kind of an average day. And you're just constantly kind of moving into tactics over strategy. And then you add on the layer of following the social chatter. And you can see this happen in real time. You know, I would not have to guess what the reporters were interested in covering. I could see exactly what they were interested in covering. I could see the biases. I could see them reveal their preferences as well. And that impacts the practice of politics, you know. And I think more to the point, more broadly, if you look at the information economy, what's troubling so many people about trust in their government is, and their media, is that the media used to write the first draft of history and you had nothing to compare it against unless you were there watching it happen. Now everybody puts that first draft of history down, and journalists end up writing what is in many ways the second draft of history. And when people see that those two things don't line up, that breeds mistrust in government and politics. It makes them think that there's a conspiracy to keep stories from them or keep information from them, or they bring their own perspective, which might not be informed. So you have the rise of the amateur through these platforms. And the fact, as Ravi made the point, it's really kind of very few people on these platforms that can lead these conversations and stampedes and moments. And if you're just to kind of wake up from your 20-year coma and tell people that, look, what Joe Rogan thinks about anything really can move a conversation now, they would wonder how that came to be. And I think it is some of the as Ravi says with kids, I think these platforms make us in many ways, in politics in particular, the worst versions of ourselves, the least charitable, the most snide, the quickest to respond. And if you have to respond quickly, that means you don't have time to think. And I would love to go back to the day where you got a media call at 9 o'clock and you didn't have to get back to someone until deadline at 5 o'clock or 5:30 before the paper gets put to bed, because I could have a think, consult the policy experts, talk to somebody across government, and come up with a sensible answer. Now, when I know the story is going online to be shared on these platforms 5 minutes after something happens, I have to say something. And it's usually, or increasingly, some version of you suck, no, you suck more, or they're terrible, or they're scum, or you can't trust them. And I think that just corrosiveness kind of eats into our systems and our conversations. And that feels like it's just getting more of that every day to me.
If I can provide a slightly contrarian view, because I think that, yes, there's a lot of challenges with just the complete influx of content and who's sharing what, and that, and there's so much of I'm going to use the name bad actors, but that may be too broad. But like, you look at when the bridge collapsed in Baltimore, right? Anytime, or like when there was that hospital bombing, I think it was Israel or Gaza, I can't remember which one. But when there's a lack of initial information and facts, there's a flood of people trying to get in there and influence what people think. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories and other things. And we need to think through how we deal with that when there's that fog of war and that sort of initial thing. But we've also had a lot of stories and a lot of politicians that wouldn't have gotten attention in the normal gatekeeper world, that I do think we need to remember when we're thinking about all this. I think particularly about George Floyd and some of those things that happened, that I wonder how that would have unfolded if we had that more traditional world. So I want us to be careful about kind of having rose-colored glasses when we look back at being like, oh, it was so great when we just had 3 news sources and everybody had the same one. There were challenges with that too. And I do think that there have been benefits to having politicians being able to at least put out, unfiltered what it is that they are saying, and being able to have that direct conversation with the people that they're wanting to represent. Now, where I think one of the challenges conversations we had. So Andrew, you were talking about like what led us to Joe Rogan. I'm going to go to Rush Limbaugh and the radio and conservative radio. And so that, which is even like predates sort of the internet around this. And so there is a bit of an evolution on this of sort of where people are wanting to go and get their information. I think sometimes they're wanting to do that because they feel seen by those folks. Mm-hmm. They feel seen. They feel like when I go home to Wisconsin and I talk to my, conservative dad, he's all talking about how the people on the coast just don't listen to him, think he's stupid, think he, X, Y, Z, and doesn't feel like he's even being able to be a part of the conversation. So I 100% agree that social media and the internet has played a huge role in this, but I don't think that we should also assume that if we just pulled the plug today, that would have, like, there were a lot of these seeds that sort of were existing beforehand that social media and the internet, I think, kind of poured gasoline on.
I wouldn't disagree with anything you said there, Katie. And I think what you saw was, if you look at the 50s and 60s, the true dominance of mass media, and then you saw the cable revolution, and as you say, the talk radio revolution, and absolutely conservative talk radio was the prototype for what then became 24-hour cable news. And I think the problem that we've had for generations in the media industry is that it's not a gas. It doesn't expand to fill whatever volume you give it. News is a discrete, finite thing. And I think, we're now in a world where everything's breaking all the time. So nothing's breaking. And I think just the sheer volume point just drives a lot of fatigue. And, why did they do it? It's cheaper to produce. People watch it. Let's have 9 panelists on, all kind of taking chunks out of each other. And that's kind of internet-like behavior. So I couldn't agree more with you that the seeds were there. I guess I just go, if I had to choose between the past and the present, I would rather have more of the features of the past and work towards putting in some of the good stuff than I think the present, you can't seed in what used to be. I think there has to be that correction point. And as I argue in the paper, I think that is, if you had to pay for these things, we'd make a pretty quick determination of how much value we actually get from them and how much time we should actually be spending on them. And the reason we don't get forced into that conversation is because it's free and we can zone out, whether, as Ravi said, or you said, like, whether we're proud of it or not. And I do the same thing. Like, look, after Chelsea play football, I will gladly go on my Instagram feed and check out all the highlights, and just like, that brings me pleasure, and that's fine. But yeah, it's just, can you retrofit or future-proof? And I think we have to do both, as you said, in that mushy middle. But we need those civil forums for debate to have that. And I think a lot of these platforms just incentivize us not, you do better. And I see this every day. If I read a column, like, from the past few years, Justin Trudeau sucks and here's why, that flies across the internet. If it's Justin Trudeau did a reasonable thing, crickets, or government does reasonable thing. And sometimes governments do reasonable things, and people need to know about it.
Great points here. And I think it points to the complexity of the issue. Many policy proposals in the paper, I think, as a result of that. But I want to start with the one that, to my mind anyway, is most specifically targeted at the issue or issues associated with the attention economy that might be most uncontroversially problematic, which are what we've been talking about mostly up till now, the addictive features. So are there proven ways, or at least really plausible ways of having targeted interventions at the product design level without compromising some of the many good things that come with increased communication, connectivity, you name it? I'm curious for your thoughts.
I mean,
go ahead, Ravi.
Yeah, I mean, I think Andrew mentioned the recommendation system, which I think is at the heart of a lot of these things. We worked on a paper recently with Knight Georgetown called Better Feeds. We had authors from Pinterest. We've had people collaborate on the project from LinkedIn in the past. And so, every platform is not a monolith. There are ways you can have these, Katie mentioned that these things pour gasoline on the fire, right? There are platforms that pour less gasoline on the fire, and there are platforms that pour more gasoline on the fire. We probably can all think of a few platforms that pour more gasoline on the fire. And they are constructed that way. And so there are ways you can construct a feed, again, to cater to our aspirational selves. And you can write legislation and policy that addresses that. And just, to the point that Katie mentioned about, like, yeah, I mean, there is activism that gets out. There are voices that are ignored in the mainstream media. And it's good that social media and these platforms can allow that. But I think the issue we get is we confuse easy with good, right? Like it makes it easy to be an activist. And then the issue with making it really easy to be an activist is that everyone wants to be an activist, right? Like every issue is activism and it drowns everything out. And you see this in a lot of, sort of just activism in the world is like, it starts off in a just way. And then all of a sudden everyone is sort of co-opting the issue in ways that they're just trying to like get attention. And it kind of makes it so that nothing, true activism is actually really hard. Yes, there are issues that certainly have been able to get out in this system, but the current recommendation systems just make it, in some ways, some things are meant to be hard. It's actually good for like you'd have to convince people if you don't already know to get your message out, as opposed to just relying on like a small group of diehards and being able to sort of engineer your way into attention.
And I think if you look at the way it used to be, if I were going to get somebody to lend me their platform, if I were going to have to go to a paper and ask them to put me on their opinion page, I would have to go to them. Or if I were a politician going to borrow the media's, I would have to make some sort of cogent argument. I would have to think through whatever. I would have to back that up with some knowledge, some proof that I have something to say about this before somebody then does me the favor of lending a platform. And I think, if you switch that now to the platforms of the attention economy, per Ravi's point, you don't have to do that bit of persuasion by anyone that has knowledge of the subject. You just have to say something that ignites a passion or an emotion. And I think this is when, when the platform started adding these derivatives of information, the like button, the heart button, and the algorithm latches onto that, or a comment or response to something. Just because something has a lot, to Katie's point about more being good, a lot of commentary underneath it doesn't mean it's worthy of further distribution. It's not a straight proxy for quality. And I think now you can make these platforms sing by doing that. And that, to me, is the difference. And there are many, like Renee DeRust, I think, and Roddy Lindsay from Facebook came up with that free speech is not free reach. And I think that's the delineation. I support people's rights to say stuff. But in the old world, you used to go to a bar and there'd be somebody at the end of the bar having, an opinion that would be wholly at peace online on Elon's platform. Come on, let's go say it, Elon's platform. And it would travel no further than that bar. Or, we all had that family member at the family gathering that would say things that were pretty spicy, and there it would die. Now these platforms join those people up and give them a convening power to push this stuff around. And the platforms, they don't pay enough attention to what merits distribution and circulation on the platform. It just knows this is getting response, therefore I will put it in front of more people to see if it gets more response, because if I do that, I make more money. It's not, have I contributed an idea? And that, should be the dream job of somebody who lends their audience to someone is do I think there's merit in this argument? And if I advance it, do I contribute to a discussion by either putting a contrarian opinion on or an unknown kind of take on an angle? And I think that's the kind of stuff we lose in the kind of everybody contributes, anything goes world that we're in now.
So Andrew, and Ravi, you should definitely chime in on this. There have been a lot of times where we're at platforms, folks are trying to figure out, like, the question is who gets to decide what content merits amplification or not, and how you actually define that. And it's one of those arguments that can get very tricky very, very quickly about who gets to do that. And now it's politicized, which has made it even harder, at least politicized here in the States, which I think has bled into Canada and other places on that, and what that should look like. And so I think that, like, I do want to, because oftentimes we talk about these companies as just these big monoliths, right? Of like, oh, they're just wanting to do this. And I do want to give a shout out to the trust and safety workers who are at these companies. Ravi and I were just at a conference called TrustCon that has thousands of these folks that are working every single day trying to figure out how to make these platforms safer. Now, do they actually get those things to be implemented? Oftentimes those push up against growth and other business objectives. That means they don't get implemented. But I just want to make sure people know that there continue to be people at these companies trying to find ways to push some of this stuff, to do some of the things that you are saying, but it is challenging in which to do that.
Yeah, and I think this is where the scale comes in. If you think of the information economy of old, it was a very distributed system. You had major publications in all cities. You had multiple TV networks in each market, and you had some sort of redundancy in the system. And I think a lot of the danger is now the concentration of content on what are very few platforms, really, where a lot of people go. And that then makes the job of those people, Katie, I agree, super hard. And again, our rules and laws don't scale to the size these platforms are. You cannot possibly adjudicate these things and in real time or with AI to a degree that, and it's great that Facebook can catch 98% of non-consensual image sharing, but that 2% is still a pretty big number in real terms. And I think that's where you get into the competition and concentration problem. And these platforms all won the race for network effects. It will be very hard to build another behemoth to come after these platforms. And so you do, I think, have to find a way to give those folks a hand and take away the incentives to be relentlessly producing content for distribution. And I think that's why if we can focus upstream on the business models of how these platforms work, I think a lot of the problems will diminish, if not fall away, and make the job of those important people hopefully possible to implement.
And I'll just add that just to directly answer your question, I don't think anyone should be deciding what people can and can't say, or even what should or should not be distributed. But the problem with today's platforms is the people themselves who are reading the content, they're not deciding. So the people who should get to decide are the people who are reading the content. And we're no longer optimizing for what they aspire to consume. We're optimizing for what they happen to spend more time looking at, right? Which gives us the rubbernecking thing, which ends up with 45% of people wanting to spend less time on these products, which ends up with 70% of kids feeling manipulated and 20% of kids seeing unwanted sexual content, right? We're getting a lot of unwanted stuff, being, toxic political content that wears us out. There's a lot of stuff we're getting because it's optimized for what we're paying attention to, not what we want. And so platforms shouldn't be deciding, government shouldn't be deciding, but users are not really deciding either. And platforms could do a much better job of putting the power in the hands of users for their aspirational selves.
I think it's a really good discussion because, there are a lot of issues that we seize on that are effects of, if I'm going up, backwards here, it really is rooted in the product design. And, you get all of this content that's questionable, but really you don't want to be restricting that. And you can't get agreement either on what sort of content, should be and shouldn't be shared. And I think rightly so. And in light of that, do we then have, very clearly identifiable harmful features of the product design that could be appropriately regulated, and would that, in your view, solve some of the issues? And I want to turn to you, Andrew, for first comment on this, because one of the analogies you use in the paper to kind of make this point is the comparison between the tech industry, and I think in particular the product design features, and the tobacco industry or casinos and the way in which they operate. Help us understand this analogy here and the focus on the exploitation of the vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and I think Ravi even touched on another industry, which is food, which has figured out the same game in terms of figuring out how our brains work and what our brains like and giving us more of our brains. But I think in particular with tobacco, you saw a very deliberate decision by companies who knew what they were doing was bad to add chemicals and binding agents into it to make the delivery of nicotine more effective. And they lied about that. And what they didn't do is give those cigarettes away for free. We at least had to pay for them. We made a decision. This is how I want to spend my money. And so the analogy I used was, if you could imagine, would we let tobacco company, and look, we tax the hell out of them for the privilege of selling us that stuff, which at least puts some money back in the coffers to try to mitigate the risks. But we wouldn't let a tobacco company stand outside the mall they owned and just hand out smokes for free to everybody who's coming in, not really check people's ages really all that hard, and say, yeah, you have to pay me for the smokes. Just go in there and buy a few things from the shop. I'll get a cut from that. Everybody's good. You go on your way. No legislator would let that happen in ever. But we let that happen for the platforms of the attention economy. And with the casino, I think it's, if you look at the way a casino is designed, and like there is chapter and verse about how these environments are designed. There's no windows, so you lose track of time. There's music, there's buzzing, there's lights. And these are all taking advantage again of our brain and binding things to our brain in a way that makes them irresistible. And I think the danger now is that you have both harms combined, in that we carry these smartphones around with us, which really, and other people have called them casinos, in your pocket, but they are. The intermittent variable reward is the brain's favorite candy, and these machines are designed to give us nothing but. And the product features, getting back to that, does Facebook have to notify me? Does X have to notify me if somebody's left a comment on my post? Do they have to have a like button? Do they have to show me how much engagement my things get? And that's what we get off on. That's what our brain likes. Oh, people paid attention. People cared what I say. If we had no external clue from our posts as to how well they were doing, we'd probably lose interest in posting for the masses, and we go back to having conversations with our friends. So there's one design thing. And they have played around with this. To Katie's point, the platforms have played around with, do we downweight that, take the feature away, make people think before they post, that kind of stuff. But I think we're just giving the platforms a pass in terms of harms, because they're free and we don't think about them. And to Robbie's point, the externalities can be quite remote from daily life. And the other added complication, which we don't get into in the paper, is that the politicians who would have to regulate and legislate around this are also the primary beneficiaries of these platforms in terms of the unfiltered access to audience, in terms of the campaigning ability that these platforms can get. And if you look at what Trump did, and in particular with Facebook, he just took them up on their offer and went to the nth degree about how to campaign using these platforms. So I have no idea if I've answered any of your question, but I think it is, we've let this harm diffuse itself through our society without doing the normal things that you would do to prevent a harm. And we can't do that now because there is no price signal in this market. And that makes regulation, and Peter, we tussled about this back and forth over and over about how you don't want a government mandating a price for these things, but how rare is it to have a globally dominant service provider that doesn't charge you anything? That makes regulation in terms of sin tax, harm tax, all the usual levers that we know how to pull and can get results, by the way. In tobacco, we reduced a lot of that harm through culture change, to Katie's earlier point, but also through regulation, package labeling, increased taxes, having legislators hold, the very famous picture of all the or footage of the leaders of big tobacco in the 90s coming to Congress and having to explain that they all said nicotine was not addictive and smoking wasn't a problem. We did all of those things together, but we don't have those bolt-on points for the attention economy. I don't see them, and we need to find ways to put those in so that we can start pulling those levers, and then use things like the law. In the United States, there's a lot of product liability claims. If you look at Can't Look Away, the Bloomberg doc that's just come out based on Olivia Carville's journalism, there are groups that are using the law to go after these product features to try to get that default setting changed and save kids' lives in particular.
Yeah, well, thank you for painting the picture there, that analogy. And one of the really strong recommendations, to my mind anyway, that speaks to this narrow targeted approach is the engagement-based tax. So really trying to target those features of the product that are trying to get you hooked on engagement. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, Katie and Ravi, about the analogy, whether you think it's right, because I would say maybe one perspective is, a lot of these companies are providing a lot of valuable things, even though maybe the value or the way in which they're going about it, as we've discussed, is commodifying the person rather than the product.
I might question who's providing the valuable things. A lot of the value provided on these platforms is other users providing value. And so a lot of people will say they use these platforms not because they're amazed by the features that are available and the user interface, which is common on a lot of these platforms. But because everybody else is using it, all their friends are using it, their favorite sports stars on it. And I saw there was a question about like what are the options for Canadians who maybe don't want to be using a foreign platform. I do think it's a national security risk to have a platform that is changing your discourse in so many ways, and you don't have like it, but it's somewhere else. It's owned by China or owned by the United States. I do think that interoperability would be a great way. It's in Andrew's paper. I've talked a lot about design changes that could help these platforms align what they're providing with the value to consumers. There are some very specific things they could be doing, but more broadly, they should be competing for value to consumers. And one way to get them to do that is to not have them compete by who has the biggest network, who has the most influencers on it, who has more of your friends on it, but actually have them compete based on who actually provides value, who has a better algorithm, who actually is providing a better interface. And so if I could read, any person's content on any service, if it didn't belong to the platform, but it belonged to everyone, then platforms would compete in that way. And I think it would be a much better world for consumers, especially consumers who are not Americans, who are able to, directly sort of affect through regulation, but for consumers across the world.
I would just add one thing on the regulation side that I don't think we like talked about directly, but I think is really important. It's just the fact that somebody like a Zuckerberg can have controlling shares and controlling voting over their company, which really limits the amount of checks and balances that you can do in terms of holding the CEOs themselves accountable. And I'd put Elon in that too, in terms of where he's at with it being private. And to me, that's some of the root problems of all of this, is that we get frustrated because it doesn't seem like there's a way of holding them accountable. There's not a board that can do it. Yes, shareholders maybe could, but as long as they're making the money, the shareholders aren't going to do it. And the advertisers are going to go to where there's users. And so thinking about some of those ways too, of trying to make sure that you do have those accountability standards I think would be someplace to also explore.
Okay, very good. So I'm glad, Ravi, you got to one audience question. I'll throw two others at you before turning it back over to each of you for concluding remarks. So Scott asks, does the attention economy provide some space for representing points of view ignored by legacy media? So that's one thing that, Katie, you mentioned earlier. I'm curious for folks' thoughts on whether that is in fact the case. And then David also asks, how can promoters of innovative policy substance capture more attention in today's attention economy context?
I'm happy to take those first. I think one, it absolutely does allow for more space for more views that aren't covered by legacy media. But I think there's a question of like, how far is too far in that? Because as Ravi said, like the content on this is like anybody can be putting stuff on there, but also, and Ravi, you'll have to correct me or any of you if I have this stat wrong, but like most of the content is created by a small number of people. Most of us are just going there to consume. We don't really share. We're sharing more in like smaller groups and stuff like that, but we're not posting as much for all of the world to see as part of that. And so the question is, and we're rewiring a lot of like, what does it even mean to be a journalist? What does it mean to be a news influencer? What does it mean to be an influencer and all of that? And those are conversations I think we need to have as part of it. But it definitely does. That's what I was kind of earlier on saying, that like we shouldn't make sure we just look at the past completely through rose-colored glasses in terms of what that looked like. I think in terms of like capturing more attention in today's context, the one thing I would say, and I think that we've been kind of talking about this overall, is that sort of that more equals better, that in order to have attention, you need to have a lot more eyeballs on something that you're putting out. And I think that it is worth rethinking of, so I'll just give an example of sort of myself. I have a newsletter, anchorchange.substack.com. I don't have a huge subscriber list, but the people that do subscribe are the ones I'm trying to reach. And so I'm not necessarily looking at it in terms of numbers, but am I getting my messages in front of the people that I want to get them in front of? And I think that is something that there are audiences for those types of sort of policy substance conversations. The question is, if you're trying to do it for general population, how do you sort of make it in a way that's understandable by them, that is something that they even are wanting to sort of consume, and what that looks like? And I think that's something that everyone's always trying to figure out the best way to do.
Yeah, I think if I jump in on the first bit, obviously, yes, it does surface things that do need to be surfaced. I don't think you can And I often get accused of this. People like the media is not perfect. It never was perfect. It never will be perfect. And over the last 20 years, we've seen a severe degradation, particularly in Canada, in the number of journalists, the quality of journalism. And I think these platforms, the other thing they do is they skew the inputs into journalism, and they make it easier for journalists to bubble themselves in a worldview. And I think a lot of the problems, to Katie's earlier point about going back to Dad in Wisconsin, is that there's been a pretty much a monoculture in power across a lot of the Western democracies that do miss issues and do have a worldview that is broadly similar. And that is only reinforced by these platforms. So it's good to have the diversity. But as Katie said, yeah, not everybody's a journalist. And more to the point, when you lose the institutional structure and heft of a newsroom that is backed by a legal team, that is backed by resource that can chew into issues over a year that might not pay off in any great click story, but do, the spotlights, the classic kind of investigative journalism, that cannot be funded and is not being done by the citizen journalist or the Substacker. And if a Substacker steps on Facebook's toes the wrong way and the Facebook legal department swings in, these people don't stand a chance against it. And so I think you lose that institutional check. So there has to be safety in numbers. And we always followed everybody's Substack. They were just called columnists, and they were all bundled together in a newspaper. And there's room for diversity and playing around on that. But I think the point of the paper is you gotta take away the corrosive elements of the attention economy. But before journalism and content can find its footing, I think you have to give it a fair fight, and it might lose. And then if it loses, then it deserves to die. And that gets to the second point about how do you stand out. And I'm take a darker view. I just think it's nigh on impossible for something as meaty and complicated as government and policy to be, to the McLuhan Post chunked out, and the medium becomes the message, and you have to kind of play on the surface you're given. Like, some things just don't play on really small surfaces, and we do them a disservice if we try to, you can do politics by meme, you can't do government by meme. It's not possible. So I'm a bit more skeptical on that last one.
I mean, I'll just end really quickly by saying that I agree with Andrew. I think if you want things to stand out, you have to design the platforms differently. Like, the incentives are just not in the right direction. And I'll say it's slightly contrarian question to answer to the first question. I once upon a time, I think it gave you more diverse viewpoints. Nowadays, algorithms are all trying to get you the thing that gives you the most attention. So we replace the gatekeeping of editors with the gatekeeping of what can get the most attention, and who has the most followers and who can produce like the slickest, most interesting video. A lot of us aren't capable of doing that, right? And so we just give up because we're like, I could post something, but like, why bother, right? So I think a lot of people are actually kind of in the middle. Like, our viewpoints are not as interesting enough to compete. And so like what we see are like the extreme viewpoints. And so we replaced one lack of diversity with a different lack of diversity. And I'm not sure we're better off for it.
That was great. I think you all weaved in concluding remarks into those responses. This was a fascinating discussion, very complicated subject matter with a lot of issues that we've identified. For my part, I do think we've also owned in on where the real source of it, on the addictive product design. But as it became clear in the discussion on a number of points, far easier to identify the problem than the solutions. And that's one reason why we're calling for more study, at least in Canada, on this issue through the paper. So I want to thank each of you for joining us, and you, Andrew, for a great paper, and to all of those listening. Please remember to check out MLI's work and like and subscribe to our channels, but don't pay attention all the time. Really limit your consumption.